Welcome to the deep dive. We're jumping straight in today. There's this huge statement that really made waves globally. President Trump declaring complete and total control of the skies over Iran. Now, this isn't just a headline grabber. It feels like a really crucial piece in, well, a very complex picture unfolding in the Middle East. It's shifting fast. So, our mission today, let's try and cut through some of that noise. We've got direct quotes, White House reports, some interesting insights from the recent G7 meeting. We want to unpack what these U.S. statements, these diplomatic moves, actually mean. What are these different pieces telling us about where things stand, and maybe more importantly, what could be coming next for U.S. foreign policy for, well, global relations, really. Okay, let's start right there. The exact quote from President Trump's social media post, he said, "We now have complete and total control of the skies over Iran." And he went on, "Iran had good sky trackers and other defensive equipment and plenty of it, but it doesn't compare to American-made, conceived, and manufactured stuff. Nobody does it better than good old USA." Quite a statement.
It really is. I mean, the immediate read is just a very clear flexing of U.S. might, unequivocal. But, for you listening, the deeper thing here is probably the strategic ambiguity. It's deliberate because they offer no real clarity on what total control even means in practice. It forces Iran and everyone else, allies, adversaries, to sort of wrestle with two pretty different possibilities. Is this, setting the stage for direct U.S. action? Or is it more of a strategic scare tactic to push Iran towards negotiation? That ambiguity, well, it gives maximum leverage without actually committing to anything immediately.
That ambiguity certainly kicks everyone on their toes. And thinking about that, how much is this just U.S. signaling versus, also being tailored for allies like Israel, their immediate concerns?
Oh, absolutely. That's a critical lens here. You really can't separate U.S. and Israeli interests in this situation. They're deeply intertwined. And if you look at the wider context, we know those nuclear talks, the sixth round between Iran and the U.S., they'd stalled previously. But the sources we have suggest President Trump still wants his key people, Steve Witkoff, the Middle East envoy, and Vice President J.D. Vance, involved in future talks. So it suggests there's still some path to diplomacy, maybe, even with this really strong rhetoric flying around. It's complex.
Yeah, complex is the word. And speaking of Vice President Vance, he put out a very long post on X recently. And one line really jumped out at me. He referenced, quote, "Of course, people are right to be worried about foreign entanglement after the last 25 years of idiotic foreign policy."
Mm. That's really insightful, actually, because it speaks directly to President Trump's base, doesn't it? A lot of them voted for him specifically on that no wars platform. So Vance's statement, it taps right into that feeling. But the tension is just, well, it's palpable. How do you square that complete and total control declaration, which sounds very interventionist, with this stated desire to avoid foreign entanglement? That's a key internal balancing act for the administration, I think.
So you've got this incredibly strong language, total control, but for us listening, it still leaves this huge question just hanging there. What does it actually mean for U.S. action? Is there a real plan emerging? Or is it just rhetoric for now? And this sense of, unresolved strategy, this powerful talk without a clear next step, that was something global leaders were really grappling with at the G7 summit.
Yeah, the G7 summit. For a lot of people, it was kind of memorable for President Trump leaving early on his 79th birthday, no less. Left the other leaders feeling a bit like they were all dressed up, nowhere to go. That was the phrase used, almost like a birthday party where the guest of honor just decides to go home early.
The mood there among the leaders sounds quite striking. Our sources use words like deflation, continued puzzlement, even bemusement, all directed at trying to figure out President Trump's actual intentions regarding Israel and Iran. And it seems largely down to what they saw as, well, confused and mixed messaging. That lack of consistency just creates real uncertainty for international partners. And that early exit, it wasn't just awkward, it meant a real lost opportunity, right? Not just for the non-G7 leaders who were there, India, Brazil, South Korea, but maybe especially for President Zelensky of Ukraine. He'd apparently really hoped for some face-to-face time with Trump to try and directly influence his thinking on Iran, yes, but also on Ukraine. Those summits are vital for that direct chat.
Absolutely vital. And you saw an immediate example of this sort of mixed messaging around sanctions on Russia. So you had the Canadians and Europeans moving ahead, announcing more sanctions. But then President Trump explicitly stated he was skeptical, said he believed they damaged the United States economy.
Right.
So that shows a pretty clear divergence right there in strategy and economic priorities between the U.S. and, well, many of its closest allies.
But maybe one of the most eyebrow-raising moments, the kind that sends tremors through Washington, was President Trump apparently just dismissing his own national intelligence director, Tulsi Gabbard. Her assessment, she'd concluded Iran was not actually heading towards building a nuclear device, but he reportedly just said, I don't care what you said, I think they were very close.
Wow. Well, that just begs the massive question, doesn't it? Who is President Trump relying on for his intelligence advice, if not his own DNI? The sources we're looking at suggest perhaps that information might be coming directly from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and that's, a critical point when you're thinking about the foundation for these huge foreign policy decisions, especially if it contradicts your own intelligence community.
Yeah, and that dismissal, it immediately drew really strong criticism, especially for those who argue against Middle East wars. They instantly draw the parallel to, the claims about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq with Saddam Hussein.
Hmm.
The argument being that similar claims about Iran over the years have, quote, never come to fruition. It's a really sensitive historical comparison, carries a lot of weight.
And looking at the bigger picture, it just reinforces what seems to be President Trump's deeply held belief that Iran is a problem, full stop, and his stated desire for something bigger than a ceasefire. The implication seems pretty clear. Preventing a nuclear weapon might, in his view, require actual physical U.S. involvement, which, for a president who campaigns so hard on a no-wars platform, taking that step would be, well, hugely legacy-defining. That's a massive internal tension.
And just as we're talking, there's breaking news coming in from Reuters. It says the U.S. military is actively moving fighter jets to the Middle East and extending deployments of warplanes to bolster defenses amid this Israeli-Iran conflict.
Right. So this immediate action, sending actual military hardware, it's happening right in the middle of all this mixed messaging we've been discussing. It just highlights how active this debate is about U.S. involvement, the type of involvement, the extent of it, even while the signals seem, well, contradictory sometimes.
Okay, so while the G7 was definitely dominated by Iran and Trump's early departure, there were other things happening. Let's just briefly circle back to trade and tariffs. Because even though Trump left, leaders were still trying to get their points across to the American team.
Yeah, they were. And the core economic arguments they were making seemed pretty straightforward. Basically, leaders were telling Trump, look, dealing with challenges from places like China is actually easier if our economies are doing well, not being hurt by U.S. tariffs. The Europeans especially pushed this. They argued they cannot spend more on defense, something the U.S. wants if their economies are being hit by American tariffs.
Yeah.
And interestingly, they even sort of acknowledged they'd been free riding on the Americans for many, many years on defense spending.
Huh.
An admission. Seems like it. But the point is, these really crucial economic conversations, they got cut short because he left early.
Right. So as we wrap up this deep dive, it feels like we've navigated this landscape of, well, really stark contrasts. You've got these very assertive declarations of U.S. power on one side, and then on the other, this kind of persistent lack of clarity about what the actual intentions are. What happens next? We've seen that delicate political tightrope the administration's walking domestically, balancing the strong talk with the no wars promise. And internationally, you have allies just trying to make sense of what they're calling confused and mixed messaging.
Yeah, it leaves us with a final thought, maybe something provocative for you, our listener, to mull over. In this age where, a single social media post can just set off global waves of speculation, where formal intelligence assessments can apparently be dismissed publicly by the president himself, what does all this really tell us about the nature of information in high-stakes diplomacy today? How do we, as informed citizens trying to follow along, how do we even begin to discern clarity and actual intent amidst these really complex and sometimes just contradictory signals?